I'm Obi Felten. I work at X, and it's my absolute great pleasure to introduce Celeste Kidd, who we were hoping to host in February, but then she got sick, and then the world got sick. So we're now doing it in a virtual way, and it's really, really great to have you. I have to thank Kat Ullman, who's the organizer of SciFu, for introducing me to Celeste, because that's where we first met when Celeste did a fantastic panel with a number of other women scientists. And we had lunch afterwards, and I just knew that I would have to get her here. Since then, my team also saw her talk at NeurIPS, where she got a standing ovation this year. And so that's what some of the themes from that talk she's going to talk to us about today. So Celeste is first and foremost a scientist, a psychologist. She's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of California in Berkeley. And her lab investigates learning and belief formation in children, but as we'll see, it's also incredibly relevant to how we form beliefs as adults. And it's her lab is one of the few in the world that combines technology in very sophisticated behavioral experiments with computational models in order to understand how we acquire knowledge, which is a fascinating psychology question. When I studied psychology in the early 90s, we had a lot of conversations about that, but it's also an interesting philosophy question, I think. Her lab employs a range of methods, including eye tracking, touchscreen testing with human infants, and so that she can show how learners sample this information from their environment and build knowledge gradually over time. She's been published in many, many different papers, including Neuron, Psychological Science, Developmental Science, and elsewhere. And she's been funded by the NSF, by DARPA, by Google, and many foundations. So that's her academic side. She's won many prizes, etc. I could go on. But Celeste also became famous for her diversity work. So she really was one of the strongest and earliest leaders in the Me Too movement in academia. So some of you might remember that Time magazine named a number of women as Person of the Year in 2017, the silence breakers, as they called them, and Celeste was one of them. So she's also really well known for her advocacy for better protection of students against sexual misconduct, and actually sued her former university, not Berkeley, but Rochester, and the case is now closed and won, which is like a real landmark. So I'm really, really thrilled to have Celeste with us today. And I'm now going to hand over to Celeste to take us through her science work.
That was such a nice introduction. Thank you so much, Obi. And also, I was like, thanks so much, Kat. I should say thank you for introducing us. So you had mentioned, I was like, this is, I'd originally been scheduled to talk in February. This is going to be somewhat of a different talk than the one that I had originally planned to give. The world has changed dramatically and suddenly in more ways than one. And one of the ways that our daily lives have changed is our relationship with our social media streams. Many of us may be noticing more posts that aren't justified given the realities of the world. So there's this. The misuse of mass is part of the problem. We had less deaths when we didn't have mass. Or this one, as a yoga teacher, I cannot encourage mass for anyone. Oxygenation heals the body. Mass do the opposite. Here's another example. If Trump canceled the convention, coronavirus cases would grind to a halt. It's about canceling the convention. I could go on and on like this for a long time, but I know that all of you can pull examples from your own streams. Rather than going through specific conspiracies and unjustified beliefs tweet by tweet and post by post, what I'm hoping to do today is talking to you more generally about belief formation at large. How we as humans know what we know and why we sometimes think that we know things that we don't actually. I'm going to try to make some sense of why people living all in the same world can come to believe such vastly different things, and why people sometimes believe ideas that aren't true in spite of evidence that they should revise their beliefs. Because I'm talking to all of you at Google and X, I also want to talk about the importance of designing our technologies in ways that are sensitive to how they impact human belief formation. At X, you work on moonshots. You spend a lot of time dreaming up and working on big ideas, trying to figure out the very limits of what's possible. Today, I'm hoping to challenge you to recognize the importance of how your innovations interact with the shortcomings of human psychology. My lab's expertise is in belief formation, and my lab started down this road initially from thinking about these processes in the context of human development. Babies have to go from knowing very little about the world to eventually possessing relatively sophisticated networks of knowledge about how things work and how they operate. The better and more accurate your mental model of the world, the more accurately you can run mental simulations and generate accurate expectations. And the more accurate those expectations are, the better your decisions are. With the right set of expectations, hopefully, as you become an adult who chooses to wash their hands and wear masks around people during a pandemic. So these processes have very concrete implications, not just in the context of childhood, but for everything that happens after that, everything that happens downstream. The difficulty in finding truth for us humans is there's far more knowledge in the world than one person could ever possibly hope to obtain, which means that an individual is forced to pick and choose. Each moment when a person has selected one thing to learn from, they are necessarily missing out on everything else. So each choice that you make is coming with a huge opportunity cost. As a very simple example, each person has only one set of eyes. So if you're using those eyes to fixate one thing, say you're looking at this talk on your laptop, you're necessarily missing out on the information that you could have learned if you'd focused your eyes elsewhere. So if you're looking here at your laptop, then you're missing out on something happening out the window behind you, for example. That simple fact has very profound implications. It means that to be a person in the world, you have to pick and choose. You're going to be forming beliefs on just a small subset of all the information that is theoretically available to you in the world. You're going to be making at least 500,000 decisions each day about both big things and small things, little micro decisions like where to look, what to click, what to explore, what to read, what to listen to, what to watch, and who to talk to. And how you make those decisions is highly informed by what you already know, what you believe to be true, and where you expect that you have uncertainty. You have to make those decisions very quickly, and you're limited to sampling and forming beliefs based on what's available to you as an individual. Since we know that people take very different paths in life, it follows that every person is going to have their own unique set of beliefs about what's true in the world that maybe roughly match each other, but which are never identical. My lab studies the systems that humans use in order to do that, to sample from the world and form those beliefs. This is a spoiler, but it's far from a perfect system. No person can have a full set of knowledge about how everything in the world operates. No person can mentally represent how the world truly is in high fidelity. It's maybe helpful to think of people's beliefs as approximations, and often very, very coarse ones, based on their own set of experiences in the world. So today, with the remainder of my time, I'm going to be talking about 5 features of human belief formation that are of particular importance to all of you as people who design new technologies for other people. Number 1, like the first thing that you should know. I picked out just 5 things that I think are the most important. So thing number 1, humans continuously form beliefs, by which I mean we are continually gathering the data on which we base our beliefs. It's not like you have a set of particular beliefs and then you're done. Often I think when we talk about learning or knowledge acquisition, we sort of falsely think of it like that, as an approximation, but it's more useful to think of it as a continuous process, a process of continuously updating, even for things that you might not think of as being continuously updated. For example, take something like your concept of cup. you might talk about a little kid and say, oh, they've learned the word cup. But in fact, their concept of cup is not done. Every time you encounter a new cup, that's a new piece of data that gets integrated into your concept of cup. And if you were to move to a different place where cups looked very different, your concept would morph along with the changing data. So your concepts update a teeny bit with every instance of cup that you observe. It might be helpful to think about beliefs as probabilistic expectations. And these probabilistic expectations directly influence all kinds of behaviors, including what the human forming them is interested in sampling next. In terms of sampling, our cognitive systems have evolved to handle that information overload that I talked about. And one of the tools that it uses to do that is boredom. For example, our system engage boredom when we're confident that we know everything that there is to know. These systems prevent us from hyperfixating, but they're doing so at a cost. The cost is that sometimes they shut down the information tap before we've actually gotten the right idea. In my lab, we've used eye trackers to study the principles that guide our sampling and our learning. I'm going to tell you about a set of studies that we did with human infants. These studies taught us a lot about how people in general solve this problem, how they weigh information gain against opportunity cost. In this series of experiments, we showed infants displays that were designed to elicit expectations while allowing us to construct a reasonable probabilistic model of these expectations moment to moment as these displays unfolded over time. So in these displays, they featured objects popping out of boxes in some order. I'll show you what they look like. Whoops. Okay, skip back. So they start with an attention getter like this to get kids' attention. Once the child is looking, some number of objects pop out of the boxes in some order. I'll give you just a moment to see what these look like. Okay, so attention getter back. And now here's a second set of boxes with 3 new objects inside of them, etc. Okay, you get the idea. Now let me show you what a participant looks like when doing this study. So here's an infant looking. The infants are controlling the displays moment to moment. So as long as the infant continues to look, the sequence continues to unfold over time. Once the infant looks away for some criterion time, almost, but not quite, then the sequence ends. So she keeps looking, the sequence keeps unfolding. And when she looks away, let's see, looks away for 1 second, turns off, she gets the attention getter back. Babies love looking at other babies, so she resets, and then we do it all again. Okay. So to quantify these expectations, we applied a textbook example from Bayesian statistics, a Dirichlet multinomial, which provided an estimate of the probability that each box would activate next, given the previous sequence of events. We can then take the posterior of each action at each moment in time and use it to compute the surprisal value for each event in the sequence. With this in hand, we can then plot the probability of infants' actual look-away behavior as a function of the surprisal value of the event. So at each moment, the baby either looks away or they don't. So we have a piece of data from each kid for each of those events. This allows us to uncover the relationship between an idealized probabilistic set of expectations and children's behavior in a simple and independent way. And when we do that, we get what we have described as a Goldilocks effect, by which I mean infants tend to look away from events that are highly predictable, but they also tend to look away from events that are highly surprising, like this. I should mention that this U-shaped trend remains significant after we use a survival analysis to control for things like time into the sequence, repeat objects, time into the experiment, and everything else you'd expect should influence look-away behavior. We've demonstrated this pattern across multiple displays, across visual and auditory modalities, so it's not just a visual attention thing. In non-human learners, we've run it with rhesus macaques and in older children. It appears to represent a robust feature of intelligent attentional systems, and even applies at the level of the individual infant, not just group averages. It also applies controlling for other factors like the posterior entropy, and even holds when we model transitional probabilities instead of just the unigram events, which are important for things like language learning. The kind of U-shaped linking function could represent a broadly applicable strategy for organizing your search for information in the world. It's been theorized to shape not only your attentional systems moment to moment, your attentional decisions moment to moment, but also your motivation for things like what to click, what to read, or what to listen to. Learning scientists had previously suggested that this kind of pattern might help learners seek out things that were just right for learning. For example, if you imagine picking up a book to read, you can imagine that this ABC book won't be especially attractive to you as an option because the material that it contains is entirely redundant with things that you already know. You already know your ABCs. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, you might think that you should go for like the most new information possible. If you do that, turns out that wouldn't be good either. That would be something maybe like this. This is a book on a topic I don't know very much about in a language that I don't speak. It contains a lot of new information. I could theoretically learn a new language and learn about a new topic, but really I can't because it's too new given what I already understand. I don't have any of the knowledge that I need in order to leverage it to learn this new material. It's too different. So integrating something like that would be very difficult given that I don't have the sort of base levels of representation. The most attractive option falls in, you could call it the Goldilocks zone. Here's a book in a language that I speak on a topic in which I have some background. I'm a fan of this book by Andy Smart. These kinds of decisions we think originate with the same type of cognitive system, which favors material that is a little bit surprising, but not overly surprising given what we currently understand. Importantly, in order to exhibit such regularities linking attention and an idealized model of the stimuli, infants have to be building expectations about the world and using them to guide their intake for information. So it's not just a smart strategy for learning, it's a smart strategy for organizing your search for information in the world. This idea is consistent with a lot of other evidence that we have from developmental psychology, which suggests that even very young humans seek out experiences that violate their expectations just a little. What's more, they do this in a way that allows them to better understand how the world works. So this is a schematic from a paper that is by Liz Bonowitz and Laura Schultz, showing that kids play longer with a toy when they haven't yet observed evidence that makes the causal structure clear. So in this study, there's two levers that control two puppets, and if they're demonstrated together such that it's ambiguous which lever causes which puppet to pop out of the box, that's a much more attractive toy than when kids see a demo with the same toy but with one lever pressed at a time. If they understand which lever causes which puppet to pop up, they're less interested in engaging than when there's that ambiguity. They like discovering the causal structures in the world. Okay, that leads me to number 2. One second. Okay, so number 2 thing, and building on those ideas that you should know, is that certainty diminishes interest. In other words, you're not curious about things that you think that you know. This is a very sensible policy for some of the reasons I've already stated. It makes sense that a rational agent should recognize that it has limited time, attention, and computational power. A rational agent should focus on learning material about which it is most uncertain, and that's true of humans. But there's a hitch in the system. I'm going to put up another tweet. Sometimes people are certain when they should not be, as in the case of this tweety person, the case of this person. As just one example of evidence for this, we have a recent paper in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review that shows that it's what you think you know that determines your curiosity, not what you actually don't know. And if you think that you know the answer, for example, in this case to trivia questions, you're not curious to check to see if you're right, so you don't, and you just get stuck with the wrong answer. What this means is that people don't have an accurate model of their own uncertainty. I suspect it's much easier to make this point now than it was 6 months ago. You all see evidence of this when you check news and social media every day. But it's actually a little bit worse than that. If you think that you know the answer, not only will you not check, if we present the answer to you, so we give you some feedback that you might think should suggest you should revise your beliefs, you're more likely to ignore that feedback. You're inclined to ignore that feedback. It doesn't count for the same as it counted when you had not yet made up your mind. We think that this can help explain why people sometimes get stuck with stubborn beliefs that aren't justified given truths and evidence in the world. Once a person becomes certain of something, they aren't considering subsequent evidence in the same way. So this leads me to the next question. Where does human certainty come from? Number 3, certainty comes from feedback. Beliefs are strengthened by feedback, at least for high-level kinds of beliefs and concepts, which I'd argue are the kind that we care about most for the big sorts of decisions that we make in our lives. This is a problem because it means that we're sometimes certain when we shouldn't be. And when feedback isn't actually available, our estimate may be very off. I should maybe add, it's not just feedback. It's a surprisingly small amount of early feedback that matters most for determining certainty. To show you what I mean, here is some evidence of human certainty not being well calibrated to how certain we should be given the evidence. These are images that are from a paper we published in Open Mind. This work was done by Louis Martin, my graduate student. And in this paper, we had people learn a novel rule-based concept, Daxiness. These concepts were just Boolean logical rules that specify whether or not something is Daxy. The Boolean rules themselves are latent, so people have to learn them by seeing examples of objects and guessing whether or not they are Daxy. In the beginning, participants can't know what the concept is. It could be something simple like red, or it could be something complicated like red and square and large, or green and triangle and small. We're using this domain because there are really good models from cognitive psychology by people like Roger Shepard that closely predict people's response patterns. These models are in fact probabilistic, typically performing Bayesian inference over a space of logical hypotheses. And so we can quantify how certain a learner should be given the evidence that they've observed. We've used this setup to evaluate different theories of where people's certainty comes from. And what we find is this. The entropy of an idealized model has little to do with people's certainty in learning, even though that same model can predict the accuracy of their responses. Instead, we find that people's certainty is coming from feedback. If people are getting answers right, just by chance, whatever idea they had in their mind when they got stuff right, they feel very confident that they know what the right concept is, even if it's not justified according to the models of what they've seen. That's a very striking finding in this context because it's binary. They're just being asked, is it Daxy or not? It's very easy to get a string of answers correct while having no idea really what Daxy refers to. Even though you might expect that people should know that that's a possibility, they don't. They feel very certain that whatever idea they had in mind when they got a bunch right, that that's the right concept. If you get a string of correct responses just by chance, even if it's just lucky guesses, you become certain that you have the right idea. To the point that when we ran this study, when participants got answers wrong, they sometimes concluded that the game was rigged when they started getting them wrong after a string of right ones, rather than reconsidering their ideas or positions. So the sense of certainty was very strong. We're currently looking at the role of feedback in more applied domains, such as reasoning about the world. We suspect that overconfidence in these domains might come about via very similar mechanisms. If you get an idea in your head, say that the Earth is flat, and you get just a few pieces of confirmatory evidence, say via the first video that you find when you search online, you could become very certain before you've had a chance of encountering any disconfirmatory evidence. The abundance of pseudoscientific materials out there online may increase the chances that that's what you'll find as you're in the early stages of making up your mind, and that could amplify these problems. While feedback can be problematic, a lack of feedback could be problematic, but for different reasons. Less feedback, rather than keeping you intellectually humble, may actually encourage overconfidence. To demonstrate this point, I want to talk about some of our research in which we asked whether two different people who are using the exact same word in the exact same context are actually activating the same concept. If you're following US news, you might expect that the answer is no. We were interested in measuring the degree to which people in the population share common concepts. So to do this, we asked people to rate similarities between common concepts, following classic methods from cognitive psychology, again, from people like Roger Shepard. Some of these concepts were political and some of them were just common nouns. We were interested in discovering how many latent versions of each concept lived in the population. Okay. So this is a T-SNE plot colored according to the clustering results from a Chinese restaurant process, where response vectors in each concept were clustered across individuals in the population. For instance, based on the responses that people gave to similarity judgments for Richard Nixon, we arrived at a distribution over different Nixon concepts people might have in the population. I should maybe note that participants were actually asked twice. So this is relative to their reliability in answering. If you thought that we all basically had the same concepts for these words, you'd expect to see one single cluster. What we find instead is that there are about 5 to 10 different distinct concepts for each of these labels in the population. Moreover, we use a species count estimator from ecology to extend the number of clusters in our sample to that of the entire population on the planet, using methods like good Turing estimators. We find that this number is approximately what we should expect to see for the entire population. When we started this work, we'd expected to see little variance in the concrete concepts and more in the abstract ones. You might expect there to be more agreement about things that you can observe and handle, things like cups and bowls, and more disagreement about things that you cannot, things like love and war. But what we found through these experiments is a surprising amount of variance in both the concrete and the abstract concepts, although there is generally less for the concrete things than for the abstract ones. Also, there's more agreement about certain particular concepts than for others. So there's absolutely variation along other dimensions. Here's an example of one concept. This is salmon with about 3 main types of concepts. And there's less agreement on this one. So the increased number of clusters here indicates that Joe Biden means fundamentally different things to different people. For this and our other experiments in this area, we get similarity data in a way that is controlling for the context. So even in the same context, people's concepts vary quite a bit. We weren't just interested, though, in the absolute number of concepts. That's interesting. But our main interest is what we were really interested in, given that this diversity exists, is do people know that when they use a word, someone else might not be activating the same concept as them? That's obviously very important for effective communication. So we looked at this by collecting a measure of conceptual alignment across people. We asked people on Mechanical Turk to report to us how many people out of 100 they would estimate would share their judgment for this concept. Excuse me. Sorry, the suspense. And what we found was this. This plot represents people's expectations for others to possess the same concepts as them. If people were perfectly in tune with the variance in others' concepts, you'd expect to see all of the data clustered along that diagonal line. Instead, what we see is that people tend to overestimate how many other people agree with them, agree with their particular concept. In other words, people are expecting that when they use a particular word, others are activating the same concept as them more often than is actually true. So, although this variation exists, people are generally not aware of it. Okay, number 4, humans form beliefs quickly. I've already talked a lot about all of the pressures on people, as like the opportunity cost that when you're, focusing on one thing, you're missing out on everything else. This is probably this is definitely a necessary part of the system. We knew that people form beliefs quickly. We didn't understand how quickly people go from unsure to certain until we started studying it empirically in the lab. We know from our work and other people's work that early evidence counts more than later evidence for this reason. And recently we've been looking about how these facts combine in order to inform us about how people form beliefs online, in online search results. People form their beliefs on online search results at an increasing rate. This is especially true in post-COVID times, and use those beliefs to make a wide range of serious decisions about their lives, their children, their health, their public policy. That was a line that I wrote when I was going to give the talk in February, and it's probably obvious now. I was like, more true now than it was then. But despite this fact, this reliance on the internet to gather information and make these important decisions, we don't understand even the basics of the way in which people gather information online and how that impacts this process. This is a screenshot from a study in which we had people look at results from a relatively neutral search for activated charcoal. If you search that term, most people get results that suggest activated charcoal, mostly pseudoscientific wellness fad, is amazing for health. In just a few clicks, people quickly transition from undecided on whether activated charcoal has health benefits to overwhelmingly believing that it does. The red bar represents someone who's watched just 3 or so 2 to 3 minute videos, and they're hovering up around 90% probability of saying activated charcoal is a useful product for wellness. That's up from when they started being 50-50. It's like maybe it is, maybe it isn't, up to it probably is. Now, with that in mind, consider what happens when people go online and search for other kinds of health information. The order in which the top hits in a search are delivered makes all the difference in the world to what beliefs the searcher walks away with. And the beliefs are directly determining their subsequent decisions, which in many cases can mean life or death. There's no such thing as a neutral tech platform for this reason. Whenever you're designing a technology that's going to deliver information of any kind to people, it's powered by algorithms that are at a minimum choosing the order in which those results are presented. And for all the reasons I've discussed so far, hopefully it's clear that order really matters. Okay, last one, number 5. Inaccurate beliefs, unfortunately, are ubiquitous and probably unavoidable. To demonstrate this point, I want to talk about a recent study in which we asked people on the internet a series of binary questions like this one about things like the Earth being flat, but also about vaccines, also about aliens, and many other commonly discussed conspiracies. What we found from a large sample on the internet is that pseudoscientific beliefs are very common. People are more likely than not to believe that at least one of them is possible. 2/3 of the people that we asked believed in at least one of the common conspiracies that we asked about. The good news is that they mostly appear to occur at random, consistent with the idea that people sometimes just get the wrong idea based on an unlucky chance string of feedback that they encounter in the world. And more good news, for many conspiracy-oriented beliefs, while believers entertain the possibility, they also usually believe that it's possible, but it's unlikely. For example, in a large-scale study that we recently conducted on Mechanical Turk, approximately 1 to 3% of the population thought that it was possible that the Earth might be flat. But most of those individuals believe that although it's possible the Earth might be flat, it's also probably unlikely. This is interesting because so many people falsely believe that flat Earth belief is not uncommon. There was a story that misreported that it was like on the rise among millennials. I don't have time to talk about it in this talk, but if you'd like to know the demographics of flat Earth believers, you can ask me in the question session. It's not as common as reported. It's not more common among millennials, and most people that believe it's possible believe that it's unlikely. That's the fact that people believe that flat Earth belief is more common is in and of itself a misconception. I was like, that's a false belief that many educated people have. Just adding one more piece of data to the pile that it's impossible to totally have an accurate worldview, even if you think of yourself as being very science-minded. Okay, so that's it. Those are the 5 things that you should know about human beliefs. All of those taken together are really important, I think, because they demonstrate that technology always interfaces with psychology. Whenever you're designing a technology that is going to interact with people, it's important to consider what the impact on those people is going to be. What impact a particular technology has on a person is going to depend a lot on the context, not just the socioeconomic context of someone's situation, but their knowledge context as well. There's a lot that everyone who attends a tech talk like this very likely takes for granted about what you know about how content on the internet comes to be. You know that anyone can post anything. You know that content on certain topics is very likely to reflect fringe views. You know that because you've had access to the internet for a long time. For most of you, likely in many different iterations as it was being built up. So when you encounter something that seems not quite right on the internet, it's relatively easy for you to discount it because you know something about how content on the internet comes to be. If a child in a rural place suddenly gets access to internet for the first time, or your auntie, suddenly starts depending on the internet a lot more often than she used to be. In my case, I was like, I imagine some of you can relate. They're not going to come into contact with dubious content as prepared as you are. They won't understand as much about how that content is generated. They won't understand as much about how different platforms prioritize different content. And those differences in knowledge, in the knowledge that somebody using the internet comes into the task with, it's going to make a big difference in things like how quickly they adopt a particular belief that they encounter online. I've had experiences where my relatives that hadn't used, had a Facebook account but didn't use it very much, get on Facebook, notice that I'm not posting and take personal offense. That's something that other people have reported experiencing too. My auntie doesn't know that how different it is from a physical place, and that possibility just doesn't enter her mind, not because she's not intelligent, but she's less familiar with all of this. It's a lot to take in. This topic of what happens when kids get internet for the first time is a topic that my colleagues at UC Berkeley are working on. I want to mention the work of Dr. Lucia Magis-Weinberg, who's a postdoc at the Institute of Human Development at UC Berkeley. She has a project in which she partners with schools in Peru. She's working on essentially developing a crash course for adolescents to teach them what they don't know but need to know about healthy habits in relation to technology use, sleep, and well-being. That work is incredibly important. Her work shows, for example, that kids don't understand that light from their phones and tablets can keep them up at night. And their parents don't know that either, because their parents aren't familiar with the technology and don't know how to advise them on its use. The kids don't know things that you and I take for granted about how people present themselves on social media, not necessarily reflecting a balanced picture of their lives. They don't have access to people who can explain these things to them. Imagine the potentially harmful impacts that lack of knowledge can have on a teen's mental well-being and self-esteem. To my knowledge, there's not similar work happening to understand belief adoption online in these populations. But that work is obviously of great importance for a project like X's Project Loon that aims to give more people access to internet connectivity. It's of course important to create equity around the world in terms of people's access to information, but people's access to truth in the world is not only limited by their access to the technology. Predicting the impact of new technology requires understanding the expectations, beliefs, and psychology of the people who are going to be using it. The internet is a vast sea of potential knowledge and opportunities for connection with other humans. But the way someone in a rural place with little or no previous experience navigating that vast sea, with little or no understanding of how that sea was created, or the ways in which some information in that sea perhaps probably shouldn't be trusted, that's potentially dangerous. All this is to say that technology that delivers information has profound impacts on what people believe. Our beliefs form the basis of our decisions, and that's not just true at the individual level, that's true as a whole, and that's become even more clear in these times. A person who's in the early stages of making up their mind, who sees something like this high up in their streams, is going to conclude something very different from someone who instead sees something like this, sees things like this. And for my final point, we can't know when technology is ethical without understanding psychology. Thank you all so much for listening to my talk. Thank you to the people who gave me funding for this, and I forgot DARPA should be on there too. And a big thank you to my lab, everybody who had a hand in doing this very collaborative work, especially the people in pink directly worked on the projects that I talked about. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Celeste. I wish you could now hear the applause. There's about 600 people on the live stream now. So thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating talk. I'm going to go to the dory now and read out the questions, and I'm going to do it in order of what people upvoted. And I'm embarrassed to say mine got upvoted, so I'm going to ask you a question first.
Okay.
So you talked about boredom, and I loved your picture of bored toddlers. In the pandemic, my kids, who are 7 and 12, spend a lot of time on screens, which means they're never bored, but they're constantly info overloaded. Should we ensure that our kids are bored regularly?
That is a great question. Boredom is a cue that can mean I am understimulated, but a stimulus offering something in terms of learning is one thing that pulls attention on the opposite side of that dynamic, but it's not the only thing. So there's both high-level motivations for attending to something like, ooh, this is interesting, I'm learning something, ooh, I like this person and I want to learn more about them, ooh, I'm very interested in this topic, let me learn more. That's like a high-level polar magnet to pull you in. It's not the only thing that pulls people in. So there's low-level features of the world that also draw attention. And it'll be obvious why, it's like some of those are adaptive. So movement, it's like if you want to make sure that you are on guard and a predator doesn't come and eat you, you should attend to anything that's moving. Movement pulls attention, which like things on screens tend to have. Luminance differences, so things that are bright and shiny, things that make noise. All of these are low-level pulls on our attentional system, which means that as like being super into something, especially if it has all of those like low-level pulls, is not a good indicator that learning is happening. So I'm definitely not, there's usually a lot of questions on screens. There is no answer to are screens good or are screens bad, because screens are all different. And I imagine this demographic of, you guys know this like better than anybody else. You shouldn't conclude that your kid is learning because they are attending to a screen. But yeah, it's like there's multiple reasons why they could. TV, you have to be cautious of because it has all those bright and shiny features.
Okay. So we have to find other things that are bright and shiny to distract them. Question from
they could be attracted to the screen both because they are learning things and it is bright and shiny, but bright and shiny is always going to pull. So that's why kids go into that like zombie mode.
Okay. Question from Sharifa. Are your findings the same across genders and geographic regions or cultures?
So we have run some of our studies with the Chamane. That's an indigenous group of farmer foragers in the lowlands of Bolivia, including as like touchscreen studies about exploration. What we generally find is the same kinds of patterns in Chamane and US populations, even when they're touchscreen studies. There's a few like minor differences, like the Chamane kids are much physically stronger, and so if something doesn't work, they have an increased bias to like, oh, kids, try pressing it harder. Chamane kids press it like really, really hard, and so that slows them down a little. But we haven't seen differences in these basic attentional dynamics across cultures, and we haven't seen differences across genders either.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Hans-Peter. And he says, in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, he writes about research showing how psychobilin, LSD, etc., can make the brain of adults in MRI scans look like the brain of children 5 years and younger. Have you looked at how psychedelics influence the adult brain and its impact on creativity and beliefs?
We have not, but I have talked to Michael Pollan and also Alison Gopnik and Michael Pollan. Azek have talked a lot about this. They are founding a new research institute at UC Berkeley specifically for studying this. So I am fascinated. It sounds totally plausible like that psychedelics might make you more like a kid. I should maybe add, I'll finish this thought and then I'll say the next thought. If you're interested in that, follow Alison Gopnik on Twitter and other things. And there's like more coming on that soon from her lab. People ask me a lot, how can I become as curious and childlike in my ability to learn? And I don't know. There's a common assumption that kids are like, there's a romanticizing of being a kid and being more curious, and they are more curious, but they also know way less about the world. You're attracted to learning about stuff in part because you have some background knowledge. A kid who doesn't know anything, if you think about the world in terms of like a bunch of different topics you might explore, if you don't know anything about any of them, anything you hand them will be equally attractive. A piece of tape is fascinating to a toddler because they don't know anything about tape. So while it's true that adults maybe have peakier interests, they're less interested in tape. If you know a bunch about sports, maybe you want to know even more about sports. If you're super into political science, you want to know more about the history of political science. Their interests are peakier, but the urge is not. I know no evidence that says like adults have less drive to gather information. Everybody who's sitting here listening to this talk, even though I'm probably not telling you anything that like directly helps you get food or do your job better in a direct sense. So it's like is indulging their curiosity. We watch movies, we listen to music. It's like adults are very curious too and have a strong drive, and I don't think that we know, and I'm skeptical of claims that like kids have a more intense drive. They're just less picky about what they're curious about.
Maybe we can learn from that too.
Yes.
Okay, next question is from Doris. Understanding all of this, how can we engage in meaningful discussions with conspiracy theorists or evidence deniers? If they're shaped from their prior beliefs, I can't change their past education and perception, and it seems no matter how much evidence is presented, they're still going to be stuck in their beliefs.
Yeah, so it does not mean that it is hopeless. I talked about how our attentional and learning systems operate in a kind of like, you could think of it as like a default mode, but there's other things that motivate people to act, especially interpersonal things. Being an authority figure or a prestigious person, those voices are more likely to influence people. There's a lot of psychology research that's not from our lab showing this. Michael Rainey has work specifically, he's another colleague at UC Berkeley in the School of Education. He has worked specifically on how to change people's minds, how to dissuade them of conspiracy theories. And one of the things that he has learned is talking to people, connecting with people, showing them respect. People are more inclined to to listen to people that they like and that respect them. You may be able to get them to consider evidence when you are talking to someone that you would not be able to get them to consider if they came across it posted by somebody that they didn't know. So it's not hopeless. It's you as a person in the world, interacting with other people and making connections. There's the potential to do a lot of good, and I hope that some of what people will take away from this talk. It's easy to get angry. It's easy to see somebody else's words and actions as being hurtful when you are operating under the default assumption that they should know everything that I know. Once you point out that that's literally impossible. No two people know the same set of things. Nobody has seen exactly the set of things that you have seen in the exact order with the exact same motivations. Cutting people slack in that regard and knowing that they're going to get stuff wrong, it's inevitable. So I can be not angry. I can talk to them calmly. I hope helps build personal connections and win hearts and minds for all of us knowing more about the world than we possibly could as individuals. It's like individuals sharing knowledge with others, trusting each other is our strength as a species. It's why we have planes and laptops and everything else. We need each other to learn. So cut your conspiracy theory friends some slack and just talk to them.
I love it. Personal connection.
Yeah.
Next question is from Danielle. I'm curious how your work has shaped your beliefs about reality itself. What does truth mean to you? Small question, Danielle.
Oh man, that's a really big one. Yeah, so everything is an inference. It's like even visual perceptions are really inferences. I think I've changed from thinking about things in terms of knowledge as things that you hold on to that are true in the world. I rarely use that word anymore. I think of everything in terms of beliefs, and I think of the beliefs as being inferences. And my goal as a human, not as a scientist, also as a scientist, being to try to make my beliefs, try to make my beliefs generate the most accurate predictions possible. And also knowing, just accepting, you don't have direct access to the truth. You don't have direct access to the truth. Remaining humble and knowing that no matter how certain I am, that certainty signal is not a good signal to be using. Since we ran all of those experiments, I definitely, yes, I used to use the phrase you should check on the shelf. I'm sure it's there. I pretty much never say I'm sure or I'm certain because it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter for determining whether or not that's actually true. So it's made me more humble to realize that I don't have direct access.
Right. Next question is from Eric. You're a scientist and you professionally depend on the capacity to update beliefs based on new evidence, which may or may not fit your old models. do you use specific techniques for overcoming the biases that you describe? And how do you extend those learning and techniques to models and decisions in personal life?
Yeah, so we, everybody in the lab, we've had discussions where we've noticed that we all started to, after Lewis's first paper that found like it's like the last 5 answers that you got that are determining how certain you feel. After that paper, we all found ourselves starting to say like, no, I know that that spreadsheet is on that computer. I was like, I'm certain to like not, we'd like start to say it and then stop. We're working on testing the idea now that knowing something about your own cognitive biases, so it's like knowing where your certainty comes from, could help moderate your decision making. Like how emphatic are you, how stubborn are you, in insisting something when somebody else disagrees. This is anecdotal, but all of us personally have felt ourselves gradually not, I don't trust my certainty anymore. I was like, I always was a person who took a lot of notes. I was like, life before science, I was in training to be an investigative reporter, and I just didn't trust, it's better, you want records of everything. So I was always a person that kept a lot of records and went back and didn't trust myself. And my research has just strengthened that propensity that already existed.
Thank you. Okay, Ida says, this is awesome, Celeste. And then she asked about the screens. I think you already answered part of this. What is it about screens that draws kids in and makes them zombies? I think you talked about the sort of shininess and the color and the movement and so on. So her question is, how can we get them as into and maybe even addicted to homework or summer work?
If you put it on a screen, I was like, that would like make it bright and shiny. And the educational TV is not a silly idea. You have to be careful because you can think of like, a kid's attention as being like bandwidth limited. So if they're like processing all the like bright, shiny, flashy, there may not be as much space for like other things that you actually care about getting in there to get in there. I maybe, since this wasn't exactly the question, if a kid is watching something and you're sitting there noticing that they're not moving and they're super into it, but you're wondering if they're actually taking anything away, you can ask them questions. You can follow up with them and ask, and that will be hugely informative. Sitting and talking to your kid about what's on the screen will give you this again is anecdotal, but I was like, we'll give you a great sense about how much they're actually taking away from it. Talk to your kids, watching TV with your kids, even if it's something that's kind of material that's wasn't created to be educational. If you're sitting there and talking to your kid about it, you can make it educational. I've had all sorts of deep, meaningful discussions about things like sexism when my toddler was watching things that weren't created with the intention of being educational at all. So, the TV can be supplemented with other things and is not necessarily bad because it is very engaging because it's bright and shiny.
Thank you. So there's actually a ton more questions, but we're at time. So I want to be respectful to people who are joining the next meeting.
Maybe it would be useful to also say I have email and I have Twitter and I'm very Googleable, so you can do that and that's not unwelcome.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for offering that. And thank you so much for this fantastic talk. It's been incredibly inspiring.
Oh, nice.
So we'll switch over to the next link now and I'll see you on the other side.
Thanks.
Thank you.